We good? Sweet. Okay, cool. So, welcome to the third Chord-o-class. I was mentioning just before we got on that this is a different feeling class for sure because we are not a gigantic university lecture hall group number of people. We are a small, intimate, smaller class that we can have kind of more focus talks. And I originally envisioned the class kind of like this, where we have somewhere between 4 to 8 people. So it's cool that we get to kind of experience the first one of those today. Today's topic is balancing acts and draft navigation. I had originally concepted this as like power versus synergy in draft, and like making those distinctions. You always have those picks where it's like, oof, this is the better card, but like, does this go with my deck? Both like big picture what my archetype is doing and small picture what my cards are doing. I think it's always a very common and reoccurring question. Then I figured, what's actually better? I think I actually want to broaden this a little bit to talk about a bunch of different balancing acts in draft. So if anybody remembers or has seen this, I did an episode of the podcast a few months ago at this point called Common Draft Navigation Mistakes. And one of the things I talked about was draft is kind of a balancing act of balancing acts in a way, where it's just like you just got all of these different scales you're trying to weigh perfectly, and like a little bit of this, a little bit of that, power versus synergy, flexibility versus power, like all those that kind of stuff. So we're gonna talk about that. We're gonna talk about kind of everybody here, where they lie on their comfortability, just being able to navigate all those kind of facets of draft. And yeah, let's just get into it. First of all, I want to say welcome, everybody, returning and new folk alike. If you have not been to a class or watched one of these classes before, I am excited to to see what you think of it. Excited to welcome you as a new person. And for those coming back, I'm glad you enjoyed the last ones. I'm glad you want to continue these. These have been a lot of fun, a lot of good feedback. We have a lot of cool stuff coming up in the next few weeks as well. So for anybody watching this on the YouTube and wants to get in on the action, check out the stuff down below. You can check it out, or anybody listening to this, contact me if you want to get in on one of these classes. Okay, so without further ado, actually, one thing, a little bit of ado. I want to shout out Patrick, who is the person I'm actually working on these classes with. He is my professional education consultant. Patrick's been awesome every step of the way. He has helped me with design kind of the rough curriculum, giving me a bunch of awesome ideas for group activities, structure for the class. One of the things that's been really cool is, like, as a content creator, I think I get, or all content creators get very kind of like focused, and like parasitic isn't the word. I'm trying to use like a magic analogy here, but it's very much like you're in your own space, and it's very hard to see kind of the big picture sometimes. And bringing somebody else from the outside has been really helpful, just to see like, what does somebody, what are some cool topics that people would like to dig into a little bit, some things to engage with. Patrick's been awesome with that. So maybe a little bit tangential from Magic in general, but if you are at all involved in the education space or the consulting in the education space, I just want to give Patrick a shout out. And I'm going to give, if anybody wants his info, you can reach out to me, but I'm also going to link it in the description of this video for anybody watching. So yeah, again, shout out to Patrick. Okay, now without further ado, let's get into today's agenda. So today's agenda, we've got a quick intro vocabulary rundown. A lot of the things we're going to be talking about today, I want to make clear that we're all speaking the same language, essentially. And especially with Magic, there are, like, if you're not like fully entrenched in Magic, and I think, a lot of, if you're taking a class here, you're entrenched enough that, you're definitely going to know a lot of these terms. But I think some of these terms can get kind of like nebulous, and like we kind of lose the real meaning of the terms, or they kind of get muddied, and we start to kind of like, there's a lot of jargon. I just want to basically make sure we're on the same page, essentially. Then we're going to talk about those balancing acts I was talking about before, and we have 2 group activities, and that's our day for today. So we're going to go through a few words today here, and I'm going to go through them, put them up on the screen. Anybody in chat or in the, you can just raise your hand and I'll let you talk, or you can just talk. It doesn't matter. It's a small enough group that I don't think we're going to be talking over each other. Or you can just post in chat. Give me your, your thoughts on what the word means, where you've seen it used in context, the way you interpret it. And we'll just go from there. The first word is power, and of course it's a very that's in itself is very bit vague, because like, what am I talking about? Am I talking about power and toughness? I'm mostly talking about in the context of draft navigation. What does it mean when somebody says you want to focus on power, right? Early in the draft, make sure you focus on power, make sure you get powerful cards. Like, what, like, how do we define what's anybody's take here?
I
Yeah.
guess. I mean, I'd say these days it almost just comes down to like game in hand win rate.
Yeah.
It is just a card that you're gonna play that wins you the game.
Yep.
Absent all other context. It's probably a little more nuanced than that. That's sort of my starting point on just take the card that wins games.
I think it's the gold standard, honestly. I really think it is. And it's interesting, like the way you phrased it. You said it's cards that win games, and that in itself is a little bit interesting to dive into, because if you look at a card like Kapatek Wrecker or like Life of Toshiro Umezawa, those are cards that, like, it's not like, oh my god, like that just like I instantly. Oh, I mean, sometimes it feels like
6/6 flyers.
Exactly, it's not 6/6 flyers. I was gonna say you don't feel like you instantly won the game when you cast it, but then again, when you cast Life of Toshiro on their one toughness creature, sometimes you do feel like you won the game instantly, right? And it's like very interesting because yes, exactly that. You often feel like, or I think traditionally in Limited, power is like these like game enders, right? But also think about power as a kind of function of efficiency and cost too. Like Magic cards are very much text boxes are only one part of it. Mana costs are another, right? Like there can be so much. Look at constructed formats, right? The best cards are 1 and 2 mana, and that's not because those are like come down, end the game immediately. It's because there's so much efficiency. So yeah, I think it's a really important distinction to make. Anything else for anybody to add?
Nailed it in one. I guess.
Yeah, nailed it in one. I was going. Well, that's honestly the that was my main point. I was gonna say. I think the other thing you can talk about is just like archetypical power, where it's just like cards that lead you down a strong path, where this kind of gets into the synergy talk a little bit, but it's like something like I guess maybe Virus Beetle is not the best example, because I think that is just a generically strong card, but there are certain cards in some formats, and in this format I'm sure we could pick out, they're like, okay, well, maybe this isn't the absolute strongest card in a vacuum. You look at game in hand win rate, this card isn't awesome, fantastic, crushing games, but it does go in a pretty good deck, and it leads me down the path to a powerful start. All right, the kind of opposite of that, or not opposite, maybe a cousin of power, is flexibility. What do we think of when we think of flexibility? Yeah, Lab Goat.
For me, I would say one part of that would be or I guess that's twofold. Flexibility, as in what decks does this make? How likely will this be a card that I'm going to play? So, for example, environmental science would be a high. Like it may not be counted among your playables, but you're always playing that card. The other flexibility would be at what points in the game is this card good? If I play this early, am I getting ahead, getting some advantage if I draw this on turn 11? Am I happy to see it? So I would probably have it as both of those elements.
No, that's great. That's a great point too. Like everybody, 2 for 2 on things that I was gonna touch on, but the class did it themselves. So yeah, I think there's both flexibility in the game and flexibility in the draft. Like you said, how likely are you to play the card, right? And the best of the best cards, of course, in draft are flexible and powerful. There's often a trade-off in flexibility and power, just because the typical, or like the archetypical kind of flexible but maybe not so powerful cards are artifact cards, right? This says a little bit different because there are some pretty powerful artifacts, but or colorless cards in general, like you mentioned, our environmental science, or it's like, yeah, you're always gonna play this, but at the cost of, hey, this card might not be as powerful as a colored card. Of course, when you get that nice, perfect intersection on the graph, and you get something like Circuit Mender, that's just like, wow, awesome first pick, definitely gonna take that, right? And then a little bit deeper on that, there's also flexibility, but like you said, with archetypes, where it's like, hey, man, how many archetypes can this go in? Is this a super narrow card? Maybe there is definitely cards where they are super powerful, but just super inflexible too. They only go in a very specific deck, right? Like the most inflexible I could think of is like cards like a cycling payoff from Ikoria, right? Like Flourishing Fox, for example, just like 1 mana 1/1. Whenever you cycle a card, put a counter on it. Extremely powerful card. Only goes in one deck, right? And you're not gonna find as extreme examples as that in most sets, but you're gonna see shades of that for sure. Let's go to the next one. Synergy. We're getting a little more nebulous here. What does synergy mean? Yeah, unknown. Matt is the unknown, by the way, for anybody who hadn't caught that.
Thanks. Made greater by the rest of your deck is really how I think of it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's maybe not a individually powerful thing, but it's synergistic cards are greater than the sum of their parts, right? And going back to our two other words here, power, flexibility. Sometimes powerful cards are synergistic, right? Sometimes synergistic cards are. Obviously, the reason you'd want a synergy card is to make. Eventually, the end goal is to become a powerful card. Sometimes synergy and flexibility can be at odds with each other, where it's just like the best synergy cards are like the most narrow synergy cards are not flexible often, like I was talking with Flourishing Fox, right? But again, if you find that intersection of synergistic and flexible and powerful, that's where you really want to be. That's just like the perfect place in a game and in the draft as well. Yeah, Duncan.
Yeah, I'd add that I think synergistic cards aren't always like not only are they made better by other cards in your deck, but sometimes they also make the other cards in your deck better.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I wonder if we can think of an interesting example of that just quickly, like a card where it's just like, hey, this kind of like holds the room together, is gonna make things smoother. There's there's those the classic like in Lords Limited they call them like the golden egg cards, or it's just like, oh, this is like a cheap artifact or whatever, usually, where it's just like, oh, this is just does everything, where it's just like it fixes it. For example, it comes from golden egg from Eldrainer. It's like, this fixes my mana, it cycles for the draw 2 deck, right? There's all these things. I wonder if there's one in this set I'm trying to think of that's like, oh yeah, just like, this is, I know this card is gonna be, maybe it's a flexible card too. I can't really think.
Virus Beetle is the
yeah,
one that comes to mind.
that's a great one. Yeah, that's a really, really good one. Where it's just like, all my future ninjas are gonna be good, right? All my future artifact sacrifice cards are gonna be good. Yeah, that's actually a really, really good one. Just how many times we're gonna mention Virus Beetle today? Two, take a shot every time. Okay, we're like delving into the nebulous of nebulous magic terms here. Value. What does value mean? Yeah, Zach.
So it's funny because like. I tend to think of it both in terms of like, if I'm talking about a card, I think about it in terms of like mana value.
Yeah.
Keep a Reckoner raid. But usually when people talk about a value deck, they're talking about card advantage more than anything else, right? That it's 2-for-1s, that it's engines where you get something on board, but you get some incremental value, and in addition to it, you're a Virus Beetle again, right? Being the top example. So yeah, that sort of cuts both ways.
Yeah, I think that's the most common definition of value, like something like a 2-for-1, right? I often think about like, okay, this provides me some like value. Honestly, the value we're talking about is card advantage value often. But then again, I've heard people talk about something like Era of Enlightenment from this set, right? Like, it's a value card, right? It's like, it doesn't draw you extra cards. It's just it's a 2/2 that scries you and gains you life, right? And scry, you could argue, is like half of a card or whatever. Mm-hmm. But like, the life gain's part of that too. It's like, is life gain value? Is that cards? And it's like, in a way, yes, because if you gain enough life, that means you can survive long enough to draw more cards, right? So it's like, there's a lot of like, and this goes back to, I a few months ago I did an episode on like the 3 magic resources, time, mana, life total, and like they're really all tied together. Honestly, it's almost like we have a few musicians here. Actually, it's funny, we were mentioning this before. This is maybe way out there as a concept for anybody who isn't in the music world, but there's the concept of how rhythm is just the same as if you really break it down into the like kind of acoustics, rhythm is the same as pitch and melody, right? So there's like certain polyrhythms that if you play fast enough, you actually get to a note. And if you put it into a music program, right? You have a certain like 2 against 3 is a certain note at a 440. I can't remember exactly what note is. And it's kind of the same as Magic, where it's like two different resources that you wouldn't think are interconnected. Rhythm and melody, pitch, I was going to play a note on the piano, but it's not on, is the same in Magic, where it's like life and card draw and, life and mana and card draw and how you're using mana. Like, they're all connected in weird ways, and I think value can come from other places that aren't just, on the battlefield or in your hand, 2-for-1s. So, yeah, anything, I guess the way I would describe value is anything that just gives you an advantage. Right, and an advantage is very nebulous and it's very broad, but different games of Magic and different decks care about different things, and it's gonna be maybe there are more descriptive terms, but I think for our purposes, value can be anything that gives you an advantage. All right, and the one that always gets Magic Twitter enraged, or maybe not enraged, but up in arms and what the heck does tempo mean, right? Like, this is the absolute most deep dive nebulous of nebulous. Like, I know you can kind of, when I say tempo, you probably have something that comes to mind, but actually defining it is really quite difficult. So, does anybody want to take a stab at it? Yeah, Labgo, go ahead.
Just on the base rate, it's often maybe a mana advantage. But like you said, there's more to it than that. So, for example, bouncing I think most people will understand that bouncing a creature or tapping your opponent's stuff, that's a tempo play.
Yep.
Just on the base, but it can also, so it's both mana and turns, which are kind of the same thing, other than turns also draw you cards.
Yep.
So are you getting some kind of advantage there? And you can also think about whether or not tempo matters in the particular game you're playing.
Yeah, that's I think a pretty good baseline description of it. And I think we could talk for hours about this, so I won't get too far into it. But I think in general, the two things I think about tempo, like you touched on here, is just like a tempo card is a card that like gives you some sort of mana advantage, bounces your opponent's creature, and like sometimes there's like the interwoven implied tempo means you're going down a card, or often like when we think a tempo card, that kind of implies tempo at the cost of a card, right? Like an unsummon, right? It's just like you're down a card, but you're up tempo. There's kind of that implication, but it's not necessarily intrinsically tied. You can have a good tempo card, like for example, Moonsnare Specialist, right? The 4 mana 2/2 comes in, bounces a creature. You're not down a card there, but that's a good tempo card, right? And then there's also like the definition where you can talk about just like how you can get a tempo advantage on your opponent by spending more mana than them. If your cards are more efficient than your opponent's, you're going to be up on tempo because you're going to get on board quickly. You're going to be able to leverage your tempo advantage because, one bounce spell sends them, back to the Stone Age. So, it's certainly one that, maybe for another time we could go way deep, but that's a really good baseline. Okay, so let's just talk about those three balancing acts that I was talking about, just as a refresher or as somebody who hasn't heard of these before, heard me talk about them. In draft, I'm always, draft is great because there's so many different things you have to consider in every draft, right? You have to consider not just deck building, your curve, your mana cost, what colors you're in and stuff like that, but like in the draft, you have to figure out like what cards you're going to see in the future. You have to figure out how likely am I to see this specific part from my deck, or how likely is it that I move into another deck, right? It's all these balancing acts, and the first one that I think is the most key one is often power versus flexibility, the kind of like we were talking about earlier today, and I think that this is one that defines how you navigate drafts more than any other of these balancing acts we're going to talk about, where it's like often you could choose to bias one way or the other. And they're not always, you go in the power route, you're losing flexibility. You're going down the flexibility route, you're losing power. But they are, in some points they intersect. In some points they are, kind of opposites. So I think of power as, like we were talking about, just like intrinsically, this card has the high game in hand win rate, yada yada yada. Flexibility as this card's gonna make my deck more often. And like I was mentioning, there's often a trade-off there, but not always. The second balancing act I think about is what you have in your pile versus the promise of what's to come. And I put the promise of what's to come in quotations because nothing is really promised in draft. You're just kind of at the whims of what you're going to see and, what other people pass you. There is some implications of what you're going to see based on the cards you see currently, right? Of course, there's always that. But nothing is promised, really. I think often, like if I had to put some numbers to it, let's just say you're in pack 1 and you see at the end of pack 1, I ask you, hey, what color do you think was the most open at the end of pack 1, right? And you say, well, I think red was pretty open, right? And I go, okay, well, do you think that means red's going to be open in pack 3? And you go, yeah, probably. That's the idea anyways. I agree with that. I do agree. And often I'll say, hey, it's open in pack 1. It's going to be, I'm going to see that stuff in pack 3. But I would put the percentage that you actually see the same color you see in pack 1 and pack 3 at like 60% maybe. Or sorry, I should say the same color being open. I'd put it about 60%. And so it's like not only are you weighing, like, a lot of things can happen, right? So people can open a red rare, they cut you, they notice that the color is really open one way, they back cut you, right? That's the kind of things that can happen. So you're weighing not only what you have in your pile versus the promise of what's to come. When like number one, if what you have in your pile matches up with the promise of what's to come, you've taken red cards, you see reds open at the table, quote unquote, and that promise is like, okay, cool, like I might be seeing good red cards, that's cool. But then there's also weighing, hey, what if my cards in my pile aren't matching up with what I'm seeing? Is it worth continuing down this path of, I've got a bunch of good blue cards, but now I'm seeing red cards? Or let's say you were inflexible a little bit early, you took red and black cards, or sorry, blue and black cards, and then you saw the red cards. What do? How do you reconcile that? So that's a huge balancing act. And then another one, last one here, is localized power, just powerful cards, game in hand win rate again, versus archetype strength, powerful decks, right? For example, last night and the days previous, I was kind of soft forcing mono red decks, partly for my own entertainment, partly for my preparation for the podcast that I just put out on drafting red in this format. And I certainly made a lot of concessions. Like, if my idea, the conjecture I could have put out there is, hey, I think that like a close to mono red deck is maybe one of the best decks in the format, right? And I first pick Iron Apprentice or something. I'm certainly giving up localized power for archetype strength, for perceived archetype strength in the future, right? And that's a really extreme example, but there's certainly times where, think about Crimson Vow, right? You open up a good example. You open up a Torrens, right? Torrens is just like, green, white, gold card at rare. Awesome card, fantastic card. Green, white was crap though, right? So it's like, well, I mean, like, which one do I take here? That's a huge balancing act too. Not just pick one, pack one, but as you go through the draft. Okay, let's get into some group activities. Enough babbling from me. So we have 4 questions to answer. We've got, I believe, 6 people here, so we can do nice, clean, 2 groups of 3. I'm gonna post these in the Discord, by the way. I should have mentioned before, if you're not in the Limited Level Ups Discord, there's a Chord-o coaching channel there. If you're not there and you can't join quickly, no worries. I'll just post these in the chat here to look at. 4 questions I want everybody to talk about. Come back. Number 1. How do you see the 3 balancing acts and Neos? How are you kind of like, how have you encountered them yourself? How's that affecting your draft? 2, how much is Neo driven by synergy versus power? Where's that balance there? When do you often lock into your lane in Neo? And this is where we're getting to the draft navigation part of it, where it's just like those balancing acts putting into practice. And here's one that, like, I think comes up not just in this format, but in others. But I think it's kind of, there's some key ones we've talked about if you've listened to any content or streams and stuff. But what are some common false signals in this format that you go, oh, this might be open? That could be based on archetype strength, and just like, the key example I'm going to give here is that green is often like, it's often easy to get lulled into green because you're like, ooh, late good commons, but there's so many good green commons that maybe that just happens, it's not open, right? But there's other things too where it's like, oh, sometimes the people at the table aren't valuing this card where I would value it, and I see it as kind of a false signal, or I get excited about it when maybe I shouldn't. So again, we'll break out into groups. Let's have the first 3 people who got here, so Matt, Slabgoat, and Zach in one group. The last 3 people who got here in another. You can just, if you want to, one of you start a new meets and just post it in the chat here, or post it in the Limited Level Ups Discord, whatever works, and we'll come back in, let's say 15 minutes. We'll come back at, it's 11:32 on my time. Come back at 11:47, let's say. And again, I'll post these in the chat and in the Discord for anybody. Yeah, so let's regroup, and let's have a little convo. So let's try, let's see. Whose group wants to go first, actually? Does anybody have any strong feelings that really wants to really wants to share their feeling? If not, I can just we'll just designate, maybe just use Zach's group first.
Yeah, I can. I think. I'm trying to check back on the list of questions
For sure.
to see our.
Here, I'll bring it up here.
Yeah. So our balancing. We were all in this space where we're looking ahead to red being open, but not quite having had that experience yet.
Yep.
And so, the power versus, synergy versus flexibility, all this we're saying, like, we're just taking the best cards and counting on fixing and all of these things to be there, and that you almost don't have trade-offs in this format in some ways because there's so many overlapping synergies. So I think it was LabGoat brought up the Womb Shrieker, right? It's in this black green space where it doesn't really have a strong synergy. It's just recursion, right? But it's also an enchantment for green white synergies, and it's also an ETB creature for ninja synergies, and it's also all of these things. And there's just like a lot of cards like that where it's a synergy card, but it doesn't limit your flexibility. It's a powerful card, but it doesn't limit, what decks it can go in because you just splash it. And that may not be the case going forward because we're going to have to start making more calls about like whether do I get into these like red aggro decks if it's there early on. Those aren't as flexible, and you've got to kind of like abandon those cards if you want to change lanes rather than just saying, well, I'll take new powerful cards and I'll play all the powerful cards.
Yeah. There's a lot more of that in this format because, like, there's not very many junkers in this format, right? Like, or at least I should say it is few enough junkers where you can hope that other people at the table take them instead of you, and you often just get pretty good cards, right? So yeah, for sure. The whole trade-offs idea, or just like balancing acts. The power versus flexibility one, yeah, it's definitely less prominent in this format, I found, for sure. But it's still definitely applies, for sure. And then a lot of times I do make concessions to flexibility over power. I think it's very simply one of the most basic concessions you can make is power of a different color, right? Just like this card does not go with my other colors that I've had, or I've taken all black cards. Is this blue card, is this Moonstone Specialist good enough to take over this black card here, right? I think that is still a very common one that comes up, and I don't think there's going to be a draft format that, that doesn't come up in. Yeah, great. Any thoughts on the other ones?
Well, so part of like related to those things, we talked about like locking into lanes fairly late in this format mostly. Because you can take some power and say like, well, if I find it a fixing, I'll just play this card.
Yep.
But again, I had an experience of a draft recently where I felt like I got locked into green-white a little too early and then saw just like 10th pick synthesizers going around. And at the end of it, I realized, like, man, I would have had an absurd mono red deck, but I was a little too skittish to jump, that late in pack one when I thought I had a decent deck going.
Yeah, I think. Oh, sorry. Good.
Yeah, so I think that maybe the point in which I lock into things may be changing a little bit. I don't know.
Yeah, just as not even just thinking in the groups that we did, but just individually, I'd like to hear from people, when do they find themselves locking in this format? Like, or maybe just as drafters in general, right? It doesn't have to be in this format. Like, is it late pack 1, early pack 2, late pack 2? Could be a range, right? Could be, sometimes it's early pack 1, sometimes it's late pack 2. Any thoughts on that? And if it's different than any other formats? You're noticing a difference in how early or late you're locking in? Yeah, Duncan.
I think as a drafter, I usually lock in pretty late. Like I try to just go deep on one color and stay flexible, just like as a preference, not always. And I think that hasn't really changed in this format, but I've been able to, depending on how open a color is, I locked in, when I open a good card in pack 3, like.
Yep, 100%.
But I think just to tie it into our discussion focused a lot about like the color imbalances and the way
totally.
that kind of influences our answers to the questions. We talked a lot about how like blue, green, and black all have really deep commons and really good uncommons.
Yep.
And red and white, specifically red, are like much less flexible because red plays only well with red cards and black cards for the most part.
Yep.
So with regards to like locking in, I found it's really easy to just like coast in like black, green, or blue into like pack 2 or pack 3 because there are just so many deep commons. I just pick up good uncommons early and I'm just, going. With like red, I imagine you have to lock in. I mean, it depends on like why you're getting into red.
Yeah.
But because the red cards really just play with red cards, like you kind of have to lock into red a little bit earlier.
Big time. Yes, totally. And I also think that one of the things is that I often, in this format, there's kind of two, I don't know, macro paths, if you want to put it that way, to the draft, where it's just like, I either start with a pretty, like my first 2 or 3 picks have a pretty clear, oh, I should try to go down this path. Like I start with a Ninja Lord or start with red cards, and that does lock me in to some degree. Or I just like have this other path that I think is more common and more open-ended, where I just like take good cards, play as many of them as I can in maybe as many colors as I can, right? So I think depending on where you start, you're very much pushed to lock in earlier or later. And kind of like you're mentioning, right? It's just like red for sure has that issue, which, is an issue, maybe is a feature, maybe is a bug, whatever. And then you also got ninjas, which is kind of like in that middle space where it's like, yeah, it's pretty focused, but you could also be kind of open-ended. And then all the green decks, I think, could be, you can go kind of anywhere, really. Or like, I say green, but I almost mean green more as a idea, or as a, not even as a color, but like, just kind of like this amorphous, like, Oath being a green card, that kind of stuff, basically. So yeah, I really, I think, at least for me, depends on where you start and where you, and that's another thing too, as a drafter, your preference in this format might be, like, I know people who just draft, like, the good stuff decks almost all the time, right? Just like never not drafting those, right? I know, like, for example, I know Sam Black does that like most of the time. And I think I know also a lot of people who like to draft the more focused decks. I know people that like Soft Force Ninjas and have been doing very well, right? So I think it is very much up to the user essentially to decide what they want to, the kind of draft they want to have. Sometimes the draft dictates it, right? You can't just have your way every single time, but I think there is enough powerful cards and enough just, you're not going to get cut out of playables often, that you can kind of choose how flexible or narrow you want to be.
Yeah, on the idea of locking into lane, I think it's actually related to the number 4, the false signals, because I think one of the you talked about this, I think, and Ari talks about this too, is the idea that it's actually easy to lock into green, for example, early, because you've seen a lot of commons, right? And that's actually a real common trap, is to believe that you are a green deck because of commons, right? And I think that's, I've certainly had a number of train wrecks recently where, because all these green commons come to me at the end of pack 1, I look at my pile and I'm like, wow, I've got 7 or 8 very playable green cards. I'm green X. And then later realize that I've missed out on a lot of power because I've kind of mentally locked into early, just by, kind of being visually overwhelmed by the number of green cards.
I think that's such a concise example of flexibility versus power, right? The green decks, and in concept, are very much open-ended and flexible, and you can, like I was just saying, you can play as many different good cards you see in colors you want. But they do have a flatter power level, I think, in general, where their cards are not as synergistic, they're not as pointed towards the same thing, right? So actually, it's kind of funny. I didn't even think about this when I was putting this together, but that's such a clear distinction between red decks, ninja decks, the focus decks, and the green decks. You're always, the way I put it before, I can't remember where I said this, but green, if you're drafting green without the great uncommons, you're kind of signing yourself up for like 4-3 city, essentially. Like, you can probably get to 4 wins, right? But once you get to the top decks, you're gonna face either like more powerful multicolored decks than yours, or like more focused decks than yours, right? You're gonna guarantee yourself some, like, the floor there is pretty high. You're not gonna have a bad draft, but you are giving up some power by just kind of maybe reading into those false signals a little bit, being like, yeah, I've got these like fine medium green cards, that's fine. So yeah, I think that's super interesting, and something you can definitely apply to. There's definitely gonna be analogs in future formats too. All right, so not to. Sorry, did anybody have anything else they want to say that they didn't get to say about this? If not, we can move on. But I don't want to cut anybody off. Yeah, Zach.
This is Lab Goat's point in our group, but if he wasn't, I just wanted to get in there that he brought up a really good point that sometimes there are cards that are just like undervalued by the public at large, and you'll just see a late Reckoner raid.
Yep, totally.
And go, ooh, black is open, and it's not. It's just that some people just saw 1 mana, enchantment and passed on it.
Yep.
And sometimes you often still take the Reckoner raid because you'll take it.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean abandon my color because black's gonna be open in pack 3.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. It's definitely just like you said. You take it because hey, maybe I can play it, but don't you kind of have to have a mental list, like a running list of cards that after you drafted 10 times or whatever, you kind of clock. Oh hey, like these cards are coming late, even though I know they're good. So I have to note like these are the cards I should not or see as a blinking red signal that this color is open. Just it might be. That's the tricky thing, and you might be at a table where people know how good that card is and they just don't want it, right? So it's very take it as a grain of salt essentially. All right, group activity number 2, right back into it. We're gonna do a look at a draft here, and I know this is not very helpful. I'm just showing you a link, but I will send you the link, I promise. So we're gonna do the first 8 picks of a draft. Now this is a draft I did yesterday. Ideally. So try to do this with picks off, I would say. And obviously somebody's going to see the first pick. Not let that influence you too much. And I actually don't care too much, to be honest, because this isn't about how did you do compared to Alex. Because I don't think I'm the way I navigated the draft is all like, oh, this is the optimal way. There's a lot of different paths that's what we're talking about today. I just kind of want to everybody kind of come to some sort of conclusion. Each group kind of just note down the card, take picks 1 to 8. With some, just come back with some reasoning, some thoughts. Obviously, that's going to come up naturally. You don't have to write too much down, I don't think, but you can take notes if you want. But I just really want this to frame, it's going to be like a kind of accumulation of what we talked about, the reasons why you would take certain cards, the paths you want to go down. I think this was a pretty interesting draft as far as different paths you could go down. So yeah, I will post that link in the chat. I'll post that link in the Discord. I guess, the best way to do this was probably to have one person share, so they do have to see that first pick, but then turn off the picks so that nobody else sees, so there's no influence there. But yeah, let me just do unshare. I'll post that in the post this in the Discord, and yes, I'll give you all, let's say not too long, let's say we'll do 10 minutes. So it's gonna be a quick one. Don't go too deep on it, but 10 minutes to get through 8 picks I think should be not too little time. Yeah. So let's see. So let's pick one back one here. Who wants to start with some thoughts?
Alex has nominated me, so. Sorry, do you prefer Alex or Alexander, actually?
Alex is fine. Johnny is also fine, since that's what I go by.
Oh, sure.
Whatever you all want to call me. Okay. Alex is great.
Okay. Yeah, so I was I was presenting and kind of leading the discussion, so I guess I'll take it. So here we mostly talked about, we were between the Rare, the Prowler, and the Moon-Circuit Hacker.
Mm-hmm.
And we were basically split. all of us
nice.
A different card. But I think I talked them into the Prowlers being flexible and probably, if not the most powerful card, like the second most powerful card in the pack, while still being more flexible than the Rare.
Yep.
There's also some thought for not taking a blue-black card here when all the good cards in the pack are blue and black. And then I mentioned there's a world where somebody takes Voltage Surge here, but I personally am not able to do that with this pack. But
yeah,
of course.
Totally.
That was what was taken.
Why don't we do this? Actually, why don't we do this kind of back and forth here? Instead of doing one group does all of their picks, let's hear the other group now their thought on this pick.
Yeah, so I think we had basically the exact same discussion. We didn't even bring up Voltage Surge as a possibility, honestly. And then Matt did also bring up Seasons totally viable here.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about not getting into green at common, and that's kind of a reason to shy away from that. But nothing is powerful enough that's that there's an obvious place to start.
Yep, I think so too. So I think from my perspective here, I think Umezawa is like, it's good, but it's medium enough, like, not busted power levels enough that I would just take a flexible card in Prowler or Moonstruck Attacker, which are just like comparable cards, maybe even better cards, honestly, and cards that don't have to go to a ninja deck, are awesome in a ninja deck, but you don't have to be blue black. You could be black red with this card, you can be blue white with this card, or something like that. So yeah, I think either of these picks I think are very flexible and very like, often when I'm navigating the first part of a draft, like I was saying before, that intersection, flexibility and power, and these two cards really kind of like exemplify that. Both these cards would be fine first picks in my opinion here. You can maybe make the nod, and there's a lot of nods you can make too. Make the nod to, oh, this is black. Black is a better color than blue by a little bit. Like, or, oh, like, this card in the ninja deck is a little bit better than this card if I do end up in the ninja deck. Like all those kind of like little things, and it's like, who knows what's actually the right argument to make, essentially. Who knows where the votes should actually go. But it's like just there's so many open-ended places you could go, and just like places you could take this discussion, honestly, with just this pack alone. So yeah, we take either one of those two, I think it's fine. So let's move in. So let's just say, we have either this or this card in their pile. I think they're actually fairly analogous, honestly, just as cheap ninjas. One's a black card, one's a blue, but I think going forward, our paths have not diverged too much between the two groups. Let's go back to the other group. What do we like here?
This pick was much tougher.
Yeah.
I'll mention, like the reason that I really prefer Prowler over Hacker is because I'm much happier to get into black than blue early. Like, I like getting into blue just fine, but black just pairs well with every other color in the format. Which
totally.
Is big, really big to me. Here, yeah, I don't know. Like, I think after taking Voltage Surge, for sure, we're taking Iron Apprentice. We agreed on that. But, like, we're taking the Prowler first. We were, considering Guidebot, Era of Enlightenment. Suit Up is, like, interesting, but it's kind of out because we shipped all the good blue and black cards already. Like after taking Prowler, we probably aren't looking to get into blue-black unless it turns out that that's open.
Mm-hmm.
And then Iron Apprentice was my pick just as being the card that works best with Prowler.
Yep.
Even though it's, like, less powerful than some of these other cards, it's a lot more flexible and kind of gives our deck a direction.
Yep, exactly. It's another prime example of like, hey, this is flexible. It's maybe not absurdly good in any deck. Well, I mean, some decks it is actually. I would argue, but I think in a Prowler deck, right, with the black card that we first picked, maybe it's not amazing, but it's gonna be pretty good, and it has the outs to be really good if we're like end up red black or something, and it's flexible. You're giving up a bit of power because I think in the abstract, maybe Suit Up might be better in, a great Suit Up deck, for example. But yeah, it's more flexible. What about the other group? Where do you lie there?
Yeah, we leaned more towards Suit Up.
Yep.
We discussed like Guidebot and Era as well, and I don't even remember if we touched on Apprentice. But the downside is that, like, even though we all like Suit Up, it is a thing that you can generally get if you want one, and you don't need lots of them.
Totally. Yeah.
So it's not where you want to be, but nothing else is great either.
Yep. No, I think either of those are fine. And I think, I asked you all to do the first 8 picks. I think we'll go through the first maybe 4. We'll see how far we get, but I think there's we might diverge far enough that it becomes like just kind of tricky to track. But yeah, I think we're fairly in line sort of up to this point. All right, back to this pick, back to the other group. Thoughts on this pack?
All right, well, if we start with Nezumi Prowler, for sure taking Twisted Embrace here.
Yep.
Start with red cards, Patchwork Automaton.
Yep.
Sure. Didn't really talk about what we do if we start with blue cards, but I would probably take Twisted Embrace.
Yeah, I think if you take blue cards, you still take Twisted Embrace too. For anybody who hasn't, kind of played with this card or heard me talk about this card, like, I definitely see this as a red card. It just pairs best with all the cheap red artifacts. Iron Apprentice is also kind of a red card in that vein too. So I think about it like that. If you start with, it's interesting because if you start with Prowler and you go into Apprentice, like, you could take a Patchwork Automaton and be like, oh, I could be black red, because I think in a good black red deck, this card is better than Twisted Embrace. But again, we come back to flexibility versus power, right? It's like, specifically in black red deck, yeah, this is better than Twisted Embrace, but Twisted Embrace in any black deck is going to be quite good, and it's not that far off. That's actually where it gets interesting, actually, because I would say, I said it's not that far off because it's not. This is still going to be a good card. But I do think this is a tier above, right, essentially. So it's like, where do you make that dividing line? And it's very much up to the drafter. And often what I say when I come to these picks is this is the kind of pick where I think from a objective perspective, from an objective standpoint, just as far as like an EV equation goes, if you want to put it that way, like Twist and Embrace is probably just the better card. As you get more experienced in a format or with just drafting in general, you could still argue it's the highest EV card in a vacuum. I think you can potentially take this card more and be more comfortable with it if you are experienced in a format and exactly how to navigate and weigh all those balancing acts. Because if this doesn't work out, you don't feel the pain of not having this card as much. And this is, a powerful, higher ceiling. So it's really interesting, just like figuring out, hey, where am I in the format? Where am I as a drafter? Do I want to go with the, take the always 8 out of 10 or shoot for the 10 out of 10, essentially, right? And that's one of the things you have to kind of navigate through. All right. Sorry. Did I
we also talked about Azusa's many journeys. If we were starting blue,
yep,
that getting into blue green, that card just gives you really good defensive speed, and it's not like the busted green uncommons, right, but it's still quite good.
It's a solid one. It's like at the level of like one. If this was a common, it would probably be the best green common. Like put it that way, right? Yeah.
It's still more of a C+, but it's like a C++.
Yeah, exactly. All right, where do we thoughts on this pack now? Back to the first group.
Yeah, so if we start with Prowler, I think we all agreed that probably just taking Kami of Terrible Secrets here is just like a good black card, gives us nice direction. And then starting with a red card, don't know, honestly.
Yeah, don't know.
Really sure.
So I think Flame Discharge is okay when you have Iron Apprentice and maybe multiple Iron Apprentices later, right? You've got a cheap modified creature in turn 2. You can make this a shock or something. You could take like a land, which is kind of weird, but if you're not like mono red, maybe you have a light, close to, if you're close to mono red, you still maybe want to dual land because you want to run a low land count, but you also want to fit in your sources for your other color. I think that's a reasonable thing to do. A lot of things that you could go if you did start down that, the patchwork path essentially. But I think if you do that Nezumi Prowler, you just take the Kami. What about the other group?
I think it was that same cluster of Kami, Hacker, and Haven. Matt pointed out at some point around here that like those first 2 packs that were really weak and kind of difficult, that like land would actually also be a totally reasonable way to start this draft.
Yep, totally. One of the reasons I wanted to pick this draft too is like just because I think you could honestly take any card, within reason out of this pack and go down like a different path based on what you took, right? Like taking a land, taking the Voltage Surge, taking a green card, right? And there's like reasonable things to do as you go on here. If you did take land, maybe you're in that super flexible green space I was talking about, you could just take land here. I think that'd be reasonable as well. Or a Sousa, right? You might just take a Sousa in that spot.
If you've already got that much fixing, it's probably Oath then.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a good. Well, if you've got that much fixing, then you're destined to open the Kami War. So you probably want to take another land.
There you go.
And then we get to this pack here, and now let's get some. Again, I think it's a very similar spot where it's just like, any of the paths you went down, you could have taken the card here. But what do you like if you're down that black path? What do you take here?
I think it's between Infiltrator and Iron Apprentice. And I don't remember what we talked about more. I don't know. I think I would lean towards Iron Apprentice given our pool because it kind of lets us play a little bit heavier into a certain space. It gives us a little bit more direction, but Infiltrator is also quite good. So
yeah, it's very much this is a pick where I might weigh what I expect to see later, and that's tough because we're not that far into the draft because I don't really know what I expect to see later, honestly. Maybe there's a few more picks in, pick 7, pick 8, I have a better idea. But if I thought that number 1, if there were a lot of ninjas that I could have picked up on the wheel, sometimes you have packs with like 3-4 ninjas in it, I might lean towards Infiltrator. If there was packs with more artifact payoffs, I might lean towards the Apprentice. Like that's kind of would be my tiebreaker. But in the dark here where I don't really know, I probably take the slightly more flexible card that's also okay with ninjas. This isn't like amazing in ninjas because you want your evasive cheap cards to be evasive, but it's still like fine enough. You can put it on a flyer. You can have your 1-drop get in so that your 2-drop ninja gets in for its ninjutsu cost. So I think I would probably, I'd be on the apprentice there in that spot. But yeah, I think the infiltrator is also reasonable. What about the other group in your path?
Yeah, we had the exact same infiltrator versus apprentice. With I don't remember exactly where the other two guys leaned. I was leaning slightly towards apprentice, but those two being just like the main things from where we started.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I feel like at least for me in the last 2 days or a week or so, I feel like Iron Apprentice has kind of shot up in my just like how much it my eyes light up when I see it a little bit. Like, I'm not like thrilled by it by any means, but it is kind of gluey where it's like, oh man, like it is really good in the red decks, right? And then in something like blue black, it can be fine. Any aggressive leaning deck can be fine. It's certainly a card that I overlooked a lot in the first week. Yeah, Lab Goat.
Yeah, I didn't see this in the group, but I wasn't really thinking about the Iron Apprentice as much. Like I didn't really want to take Inkrise Infiltrator because there was one in pack 1 and there were a bunch of other ninja-oriented cards, so I was expecting to wheel that. Spoiler, we don't, and get better cards instead. So I don't really want to have 2 of those.
Yep.
And now that you mentioned it, I think the play pattern of like Iron Apprentice, bounce it with our hacker, and then play it again on turn 2 is pretty powerful and definitely worth going in that direction.
Yeah, I would also
say, especially if we choose to not go blue-black and just only pick one of those cards. So that makes a lot of sense there.
I would also say that, well, if you're not in a focused artifact deck, you might not want multiples of these. I do think if you do go down that path, multiples do get better because they do kind of stack on each other, right? You like put all the counters on one on the other, and you just want that. You also want that consistency, that redundancy of cheap 1-drops. So it's like basically the way I see this is it's a okay filler card if you're at all aggressive leaning, have ninjas, but you probably don't want multiples. But there are decks where you get over a certain threshold where you're like, oh no, I do want all of them. And I don't know if I'm there yet. It's more of a narrow path, right? So I think this is probably a more flexible card if you want to look at it that way. Although you could argue this is flexible because it's colorless, although the second one is less flexible. All right, so I think we'll just go through these ones quickly. If anybody has any thoughts on just what they would take, if there's anything that they really wanted to, shout out as, we thought something very different. But I think going down the black path, you could take another infiltrator here. Going down a different path, maybe take Mirror Shell Grab. I think Silencer is just the worst black card in this pack over this. Also, like some weird world where you take Samurai, but I don't think that's really what we want here. In the black path, you take Kami, and I think in most paths you take Kami because everything else here is not very good. And pick it here, probably take a Clawing Torment. If you're in that green path, you could take a Jukai Preserver. Yes, Duncan, go ahead.
I want to point out that in the previous pack, when we were because we were talking about our path and then your path that you took.
Yep.
And I was telling everybody I would take Shattered States Era here.
Yep.
And because I think the card is good.
Yeah, I do too.
I was interested to see that you took the Kami.
Yeah, so basically, yeah, and we'll get to my what I did in a second, but my thoughts were that, so I guess now's a good time because the picks are pretty much done here, but let's just zoom out. So this is a sort of experimental, sort of forcing red, both because one, I thought it was like interesting to do, so I just wanted to try it out, but 2, I thought, hey, maybe this is a table that will let me just have the red cards, maybe I'll have a really awesome almost all 1-drop red deck. Let's see what happens here. So that was the path I went down, which I don't necessarily, if we're talking about like objective highest EV paths, I don't know if that is. This is more of a science thing. So I don't think that the picks we talked about in pack 1 are all quote unquote wrong. If I was sitting down at a GP or a day 2 at the Arena Open, I might not do the same thing. But in my path here, if I get the Shattered States Era, my thought was, well, this might play pretty well if I do start touch black, which I ended up doing, and I get enough enchantments, and I think I can probably pick up a Shattered States Era sometime later, essentially, right? It's just like, yeah, this is a good card, but I can probably pick one up later in my deck, so I should specify. This is a good card in my deck. I can probably pick one up later, and there is a high bar for what expensive cards I want to take. So let's just, go back to what I took. So I took Voltage Surge here as, okay, I'm like, okay, only red card in the pack. That's kind of cool. That I entered the queue thinking, let's see if we can draft a red deck, and Voltage Surge is a fine pickup for me if I'm drafting a red deck, essentially. We get to this pick, and I was like, oh, sweet, Iron Apprentice. I want as many of those as I can, if I can get that. I got the Patchwork Automaton here. That's a really nice lead into mono red. Got the Flame Discharge as well. You know what? I'm probably not playing anything else here. I've already got an Iron Apprentice and a Patchwork. Maybe this makes the cut. I took a Iron Apprentice, took an Unstoppable Ogre as a pretty good card in this deck, and then I speculated on the Kami, and I took Clawing Torment. Maybe I do dip a little bit into black, because this is a really, really good card in a base red deck with some black. So, overall, the big picture thought here that I have is there's no right path. Really, there's no right path. There's only different paths that you could make arguments for and against, honestly. And that is more food for thought than a definitive lesson, honestly. I didn't mean this to be and here's what you know, you're in your next draft, this is what you're going to do, and it's going to be much easier. That wasn't really the purpose of this exercise when I made it. It's more just opening up your eyes to potentially more paths you might already be seeing, right? And that really helps when you get to hear the opinions of other people, what they did, right? Or what they wanted to do. I'm sure when you're in your groups, you're like, oh, I wouldn't push in that direction, but hey, this person wants to, that's something I might not have done. And maybe you lead down a path that your current drafting tendencies would never lead you down, right? So I think there's a lot of value in that. I think there's a lot of value in talking about it in real time. We're just gonna wrap up here. I've got a few more slides. Yes, just last things here. Nothing big, but I do have some homework. Nothing that you have to present. This is not mandatory homework. But it's just some additional reading. I guess is maybe a better way to put it. And I'll put this in the Chord-o coaching channel in the Discord or in chat if anybody wants it. So I have two things. One, Redo has an article, Tempo and Card Advantage, a Delicate Balance. This is from his level 1 series, which goes over a bunch of fundamentals, which I think is just like really, really solid. Even if you consider yourself, more of a seasoned Magic player, just going over the fundamentals can kind of bring them to the forefront of your gameplay and your draft navigation and drafting. Often, we have heard some of these concepts in the past and heard them from somebody, but then they don't get fully ingrained, and like you read them and they kind of dig themselves back up. So I thought this was a really good article. It touches on some of the stuff we were talking about today in the definitions of what we were talking about. And of course, shout out to the episode I've been talking about, the most common draft navigation mistakes. That's on YouTube. Really kind of a companion piece to what we've been talking about today. What we've been talking about today kind of goes a bit further than what I talked about here. And so, yeah, those are my last two things I wanted to say. If anybody has any burning questions, you can feel free to ask. But if not, we'll just wrap up. And I'll say thank you so much for coming to the class this week. I don't think we'll have a class next week. I think we're kind of transitioning to the bi-weekly phase. So it's going to be 2 weeks from now. But, or unless, is that when the MIQ is? I'll have to double check and get you back on dates. But I think we're now in the, just for for some clarity, I plan to go when a new set comes out. Probably the first 2 or 3 weeks are going to be weekly classes, and then we transition to bi-weekly. I think now we're kind of at that bi-weekly stage. But I will give you some dates, and please let me know. By the way, if this time is this is a bit of a different time. I usually do 1 o'clock. If this works better for everybody, if it works worse, I'd like to know. I'd like to accommodate everybody here, and the people who are coming to the class in the future. This was a good size, by the way, I felt. I don't know how all you felt, but I like this smaller group class. We got to actually hear everybody out, essentially. And yeah, thank you once again. If anybody has any questions, we can field them. But if not, feel free to pack up. All right. And of course, if you had something after, feel free to message me or whatever. Yeah, thank you. Hope to see you next time here. And the recording, of course, will be up on YouTube. All right. Bye, everybody.